The package arrived on a gray, rain-drenched afternoon, the kind of day where the sky seemed pressed too close to the earth, swollen with storm clouds that refused to break. Daniel nearly tripped over the parcel as he stepped onto his porch, his arms loaded with groceries. It sat there, heavy and squat, its brown paper wrapping darkened from the drizzle. No return address, just his name. He carried it inside, setting it on his cluttered kitchen table, brushing aside an empty coffee cup and a stack of unpaid bills. The paper tore away easily, revealing an old wooden box. The scent of dust and something metallic, copper maybe, rose as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded yellow cloth, was an antique rotary phone. The black Bakelite surface gleamed under the kitchen light, polished despite its age. The dial was worn, its metal edges dulled from decades of use. The earpiece was cold when he touched it, heavier than he expected, like holding a piece of history. A folded note was tucked beside it. The ink had bled slightly into the paper, but the words were still clear. "This phone helped me, and now it will help you. But remember, every gift has a cost. In the end, you'll understand why it's worth it." The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, Uncle Victor. Daniel frowned. His uncle had died nearly 2 months ago, leaving behind a reputation of eccentricity and bad luck. A gambler, a man who lived wildly and vanished without warning, only to resurface with pockets full of winnings and dark circles under his eyes. His mother had always warned him not to get too close. And yet here was his final gift. Daniel turned the phone over in his hands. There was no plug, no visible way to connect it to anything, just a relic from another time. Still, there was something unsettling about it. That night he placed it in the living room on a small side table beside his worn-out couch. Rain pattered against the windows and thunder rolled in the distance. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he swore he heard it. Click, click, click. The slow, deliberate turn of the rotary dial. His stomach knotted. He sat up, heart pounding, listening. The apartment was silent now. The only sound was the storm outside. It must have been his imagination. But as he turned over, forcing himself to sleep, the thought lingered like an itch beneath his skin. Who would it call? The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world damp and gray. Daniel was halfway through tying his tie when he heard it. Ring, ring. He froze. The sound didn't belong. His apartment was quiet, save for the hum of his fridge and the distant chatter of morning traffic outside. Ring, ring. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. His eyes darted to the living room. The antique phone sat exactly where he had left it, dark and unmoving, yet the ringing filled the air, clear as day. His breath came shallow. It wasn't plugged in. There was no way. Ring, ring. The third ring jolted him into motion. His pulse hammering in his throat, he stepped forward, half expecting the sound to stop the moment he got close. But the phone kept ringing, as patient as something waiting to be answered. His fingers hesitated over the receiver. A coldness radiated from the Bakelite handle. He lifted it slowly, pressing it to his ear. At first there was nothing, then, "Good morning, Daniel." The voice was calm, steady, and strangely familiar, though he couldn't place it. It had no accent, no telltale rasp or age, just a smooth, knowing tone, like someone who had been expecting this conversation for a long time. His mouth went dry. "Who is this?" "Someone who wants to help. You're running late. When your boss asks for volunteers today, raise your hand. You'll be promoted." A sharp chill ran down his spine. "What? How do you—" Click. The line went dead. Daniel stood there, the receiver still pressed to his ear, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. The voice had been so calm, so certain. He turned the phone over, inspecting it again. No plug, no cords, nothing. His alarm buzzed from the bedroom, reminding him he was, in fact, running late. Hours later. He had pushed the phone call out of his mind by the time his morning meeting rolled around. The usual dull murmur of office life surrounded him. Clacking keyboards, low conversations, the smell of burnt coffee wafting from the break room. Then his boss, Mr. Cleary, cleared his throat. "We have an open position. It's a step up, a pay increase, more responsibility. If anyone's interested, we'll start interviews next week." Daniel's pulse spiked. The voice's words slithered back into his mind. "When your boss asks for volunteers, raise your hand." His fingers twitched. He wasn't even qualified for the promotion. The job required experience he didn't have. His coworkers sat in silence, waiting. Before he could stop himself, his hand went up. Mr. Cleary looked surprised. "Daniel?" He swallowed hard. I'd like to be considered." Cleary studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's talk after lunch." The moment passed. The meeting continued, but Daniel barely heard the rest of it. By the end of the day, he had the job. And in the back of his mind, beneath the excitement and disbelief, a new thought settled in like an unshakable shadow. The phone had been right. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the phone. The voice had been right. He had been promoted. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't just timing. The phone knew. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence. Maybe his boss had been considering him for a while. Maybe he had manifested it somehow. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was guiding him. That night, he found himself staring at the phone from across the living room, its black surface too smooth, too expectant. It didn't ring, it didn't move, but he could feel it, waiting. And then, at exactly midnight, ring, ring. Daniel flinched, breath hitching in his throat. His body tensed as he stood. The first call had been real, and now his feet moved before his mind could catch up. He picked up the receiver, pressing it to his ear. Silence. Then the familiar, calm, measured voice. "Go to the gas station tomorrow, buy a lottery ticket, use these numbers." Daniel's fingers clenched around the receiver. "Who are you?" 4, 9, 17, 23, 44. His breath came short. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing, yet." Click. The dial tone buzzed softly in his ear. The next morning, despite every rational part of his brain screaming against it, he stopped by the gas station before work. His hands trembled as he filled out the ticket. 4, 9, 17, 23, 44. He stared at the numbers for a long time before sliding the ticket across the counter. The cashier barely glanced at him as she printed his entry. He didn't check the results right away. The thought of it terrified him. If he lost, then it was over, just a bizarre coincidence. But if he won? The ticket sat untouched in his wallet until that night. His hands were clammy as he pulled up the results on his phone. One by one, the numbers matched. First 1, then 2, then 3. By the time he reached the last number, his vision blurred. He had won. Not millions, but enough. $10,000. More money than he had ever held at once. Daniel sat there for a long time, the ticket clutched in his fist, his stomach churning with excitement and dread. Because now there was no doubt. The phone wasn't just some strange heirloom, it was something else, something watching him, guiding him, and it had just changed his life. Daniel stopped questioning the phone. At first he had convinced himself he was testing it, following its advice just to see if it would work. But deep down he had already surrendered, because it always worked. Every call, every word, every cryptic instruction led to something better. One evening the phone rang as he was brushing his teeth. Ask for another raise tomorrow. He had only been in his new position for a week. It felt ridiculous. But the next day, after an agonizing internal debate, he went into Mr. Cleary's office. "I've been taking on a lot more responsibility. I think my pay should reflect that." Cleary leaned back in his chair, studying him. Daniel braced for rejection. Instead, Cleary sighed. "You know what? You're right. I'll approve a salary adjustment. 5,000 more a year, just like that." Then there was Lisa, the girl he had been interested in for months but had never had the nerve to talk to. The phone rang that night. "Talk to her tomorrow. She likes you back." He laughed. It sounded absurd. But the phone had been right about everything else, so the next morning he took a chance. Lisa's eyes lit up when he spoke to her. They made plans for coffee. One date turned into 2, then 5, then 10. One evening he was watching TV with Lisa curled up beside him when the phone rang again. "Invest in Solaris Tech. Do it before the market opens tomorrow." He had never invested in stocks before, but he took the risk. The stock doubled in a week. By the end of the month, Daniel was making more money than he ever had. One morning, as he was about to leave for work, the phone rang again. "Avoid your usual commute today." He hesitated. The warning sent a chill through him, but he followed the advice. That afternoon he saw the news. A semi-truck had jackknifed on the freeway, right on his usual route. 3 dead, several injured. A deep, uncomfortable thought settled into his chest. The phone wasn't just helping him, it was protecting him. Daniel stared at it from across the room. How much did it know? How far did its influence reach? It didn't matter. He was hooked. His life had never been better. Then the first death happened. The first death didn't feel like it had anything to do with him. It was someone he barely knew, Aaron Holtz, an old friend from high school. They hadn't spoken in years. Daniel found out about it on Facebook, a memorial post. A dozen people sharing old photos, laughing emojis replaced with crying ones. Hit by a drunk driver, died instantly. It was tragic, but random, an accident. Still, something about it unsettled him. That same day the phone rang again. "You don't need to worry about your debts anymore. Someone will handle it for you." That night he got a notification from his bank. His student loans had been wiped clean. No record of the payments, just gone. It was exhilarating. It was impossible. And then, the second death. This time, it was Peter Delaney, a former coworker. The same coworker who had been up for the promotion before Daniel got it. Dead from a heart attack, 36 years old, no prior conditions, just collapsed at his desk. Daniel sat staring at his phone for a long time after that. A creeping, sick feeling curled around his ribs. The first death had been a fluke. A tragedy, yes, but completely unrelated. But two people, both connected to him in some way. The phone rang again that night. His hands trembled as he picked it up. "You know what's happening, don't you?" His throat went dry. "What are you?" His voice cracked. "What the hell are you doing?" The voice was calm, patient, knowing. "Every gift has a cost, Daniel. When you receive good fortune, misfortune must go somewhere else." A cold sweat broke over his skin. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. "You've been passing it along." His stomach churned. The world tipped sideways. He had thought the phone was helping him. He had thought it was making his life better. But now he saw it. Every time something good happened to him, something terrible happened to someone else. His debts vanished. A friend died. His promotion? The other candidate's heart stopped. His new life? Carved out of someone else's suffering. Daniel dropped the receiver as if it had burned him. But the voice's final words still echoed in his mind. "If you stop picking up, bad luck will come for you instead." Daniel barely slept that night. His thoughts spiraled, unraveling through the early hours of the morning. Every moment of good fortune replayed in his mind, now tainted by the realization of its cost. How many times had he followed the phone's advice without question? How many people had suffered for his success? By dawn, a decision solidified in his chest. He would never answer the phone again. That morning, the phone remained silent. For the first time in weeks, Daniel went about his day without its influence. No whispered instructions, no guiding hand. He felt uneasy, like something had been ripped from him, but he reassured himself. This was the right choice. Then everything started falling apart. It began small, a rejected bank transfer, an issue with his paycheck. His morning coffee spilled onto his lap out of nowhere. Then Lisa called. Her voice was cold, distant. "I think we should take a break." It felt like a punch to the ribs. "Wait, Lisa, what's wrong? Did I do something?" "I don't know," she hesitated. "It's just, I have this bad feeling about us, like I shouldn't be here." A bad feeling. Daniel's blood ran cold. She was supposed to be his. Then the next blow came, a fraud alert on his bank account. He checked his balance, and his stomach lurched. Zero. Every cent, every penny of his newfound wealth, gone. "Impossible," he whispered. He had never even used that account online. How had someone... The realization hit him like ice water. This was the price. If you stop picking up, bad luck will come for you instead. He had stopped answering, and now the bad luck had nowhere else to go. That evening, as he drove home, his hands were shaking. He barely noticed the rain streaking his windshield. His thoughts churned, scrambling for a solution. Then, his brakes failed. One moment he was speeding down the freeway, his heart hammering. The next, he pressed the pedal and felt nothing. No resistance, no control. The car skidded, spun, slammed into the median. The world blurred into steel and asphalt and shattering glass. When he came to, his ears rang, his vision spotted with red and white lights. A stranger was pulling him from the wreckage, their mouth moving, but Daniel couldn't hear them. And then, cutting through the static, ring, ring, his breath caught in his throat. somewhere nearby, in the wreckage, in the dark. The phone was ringing, waiting for him to answer. The ringing followed him. Daniel stumbled out of the wreck, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. His body ached, but he was alive. His car, however, was totaled, a crumpled husk against the freeway barrier. People gathered. Someone was calling for help, but Daniel barely heard them, because the phone was still ringing. He turned his head, scanning the wreckage. There, among the shattered glass and twisted metal, the antique rotary phone sat perfectly upright on the pavement. Pristine, untouched. It wasn't possible. It had been at home. He had left it in his apartment. Yet here it was, its dial glowing faintly in the dim evening light. Ring, ring. Daniel's breath shuddered out of him. He knew what would happen if he didn't answer. The phone had warned him. If you refuse to listen, your luck will rot. He couldn't ignore it anymore, not if he wanted to live. Slowly, with shaking hands, he reached for the receiver. It was cold as ice. He lifted it to his ear, throat tight. The voice greeted him, as calm and patient as ever. Are you ready to listen again? Daniel's fingers clenched around the receiver. Yes. A pause. Then, good. Now pay attention. You have 2 choices. He swallowed hard. What choices? You can pass it on. Daniel's breath hitched. Find someone else. Give them the phone like your uncle gave it to you. Let them take your place, and you will be free. He squeezed his eyes shut. And if I don't? Then the bad luck stays with you, until there's nothing left. A cold weight settled in his stomach. That was what had happened to Uncle Victor. And now it was his turn. Daniel's grip on the receiver tightened. He thought of Lisa, of his job, of the wreckage around him. The price of ignoring the phone was steep. He had a way out. But it meant choosing someone else to suffer. The phone waited, silent. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Who? The voice gave a soft, pleased chuckle. You'll find the right person. When the time comes, you'll know. Click. The line went dead. Daniel lowered the receiver slowly, staring at the phone. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The choice had been made for him because he wasn't ready to die. Now he just had to find someone else. Someone to take his place. Daniel barely remembered the rest of that night. The police arrived. A tow truck took what was left of his car. Paramedics asked if he wanted to go to the hospital, but he refused. He was fine. He was alive. And the phone came home with him. It wouldn't let him leave it behind. Even now, as he sat in his dimly lit kitchen, it rested in front of him on the table. Silent, waiting. He had made his choice. He had to find someone else. But the thought churned in his stomach like something rotten. How had Victor done it? How had he looked at someone, a friend, a stranger, anyone, and decided they deserved to suffer? His hands trembled as he reached for the phone. The bakelite surface was smooth under his fingertips, as if the dial had never been touched. It was eternal. No, not if I get rid of it. A desperate idea took root in his mind. What if he destroyed it? No passing it on, no choosing someone else, just gone. Daniel grabbed the phone, his movements jerky, frantic. He left his apartment without a jacket, the cold night air biting his skin. The backyard behind his house was empty, the ground still soft from recent rain. Perfect. He snatched a shovel from the communal storage shed and began to dig, faster, deeper. The phone remained silent, even as he dropped it into the hole and shoveled dirt over it, even as he patted the soil down with his boot, even as he stood there panting. It was over. Daniel exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. He had won. Hours later, the smell of coffee woke him. For a moment he almost felt normal. Then his stomach twisted. The phone. The memory slammed into him like a fist, the calls, the deaths, the choice. Had he really done it? He sat up, heart hammering. He had buried it. He had left it in the dirt. It was gone. Right? Daniel forced himself to his feet, his movements slow, robotic. He stepped into the kitchen, rubbing his face. Maybe he would finally be free. Maybe... His breath caught. His blood turned to ice. The phone was sitting on the counter. Perfect, clean, untouched. Daniel staggered back. His chest felt tight. He had buried it. He had seen it covered in dirt. But here it was, as if it had never left. And then... The rotary dial began to turn, slowly. Click, click, click. The phone was dialing a number on its own. Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Somewhere, far away, a phone was about to ring, and someone, somewhere, was about to pick up. Daniel couldn't move. The rotary dial clicked, methodical and deliberate, like a hand unseen was making the call. The phone sat gleaming on the counter, untouched by the dirt he had buried it in just hours ago. His heartbeat pounded in his skull. Who was it calling? A number he didn't recognize, but the phone did. The dial stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then ring, ring, not here, somewhere else. It was calling someone. A second passed, another, then a soft, distant click. Someone had answered. A breathless silence stretched between Daniel and the receiver. Then the voice returned. Not calm this time, not patient. This time it was final. Time's up, Daniel. The room tilted, his lungs squeezed tight. No, wait, I did what you asked. I didn't ignore you. You hesitated. You tried to break the cycle? Daniel's stomach lurched. I'll pass it on. I swear It's too late. A searing pain split through his skull. His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the counter, gasping. A horrible pressure built inside him, pressing against his ribs, crushing his lungs. Dark spots swarmed his vision. His body wouldn't move. Something was reaching inside him, twisting, pulling. Every gift has a cost, Daniel. His fingers spasmed against the floor, his mouth opened to scream. But no sound came out. The pressure built to a breaking point, and then everything went dark. The next morning the apartment smelled of dust and static. The coffee maker gurgled lazily, filling the silence. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, streaking across the kitchen floor. Daniel did not wake up. His body sat slumped against the counter, eyes open but vacant, a faint, lingering smile on his lips, as if he had understood something at the very last moment. His phone, his real one, buzzed on the table. Messages, missed calls, no response, and on the kitchen counter the antique rotary phone sat in perfect silence, waiting. 2 weeks passed before anyone came looking for Daniel. His sister, Emily, was the one who found him. She had been worried. His calls had stopped, his texts unanswered. At first she assumed he was just busy, but after days of silence, the gnawing worry became unbearable. She used the spare key he had given her years ago, stepping into his quiet apartment. It smelled stale, untouched, as if time had stopped the moment Daniel had drawn his last breath. The sight of him made her gasp and stumble back. Her brother sat against the counter, his head slumped to the side. His eyes were open, but he was gone. His lips were curved slightly, eerily. Not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, dialing 911 with numb fingers. Paramedics arrived, followed by the police. There was no sign of struggle. No wounds, no drugs, no forced entry. Probably a sudden cardiac arrest, one officer muttered. Could have been a brain aneurysm. Emily barely heard them. She was too busy staring at the package on the kitchen table. It sat there, perfectly wrapped, as if it had been waiting for her. A small note was tucked under the ribbon. For you, this will help. Daniel. She swallowed, her throat dry. With shaky hands, she peeled away the wrapping. Inside was an antique rotary phone. Its black surface gleamed under the dim kitchen light, its dial worn from decades of use. Emily ran her fingers over it, shivering at how cold it was. And then, ring, ring. Emily flinched. The phone's sound was deep and rich, vibrating through the small apartment. Her heart pounded. She turned toward the paramedics, the police, but they were busy, distracted. No one else reacted to the sound. No one else could hear it. The ringing filled her ears, louder, insistent. She bit her lip. Her fingers hovered over the receiver. The phone waited. Finally, she answered. Hello, Emily. The voice was smooth, familiar. It spoke as if it had been expecting her. I have some advice for you. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.